Chapter 4. The Evidence of the American Lady. Mrs. Hubbard arrived in the dining car in such a state of breathless excitement that she was hardly able to articulate her words. "Now just tell me this. Who's in authority here? I've got some very important information, very important indeed, and I'm going to tell it to someone in authority, just as soon as I can, if you gentlemen." Her wavering glance fluctuated between the three men. Poirot leaned forward. "Tell it to me, madam," he said. "But first, pray be seated." Mrs. Hubbard plumped heavily down onto the seat opposite to him. "What I've got to tell you is just this. There was a murder on the train last night, and the murder was right there in my compartment." She paused to give dramatic emphasis to her words. "You are sure of this, madam?" "Of course I'm sure. The idea? I know what I'm talking about. I'll tell you everything there is to tell. I gotten into bed, got asleep, and suddenly I woke up. Everything was dark, and I knew there was a man in my compartment. I was just so scared I couldn't scream, if you know what I mean. I just lay there and thought, mercy, I'm going to be killed. I just can't describe to you how I felt. These nasty trains, I thought, and all the outrages I read of. And I thought, well, anyway, he won't get to my jewelry, because you see, I put that in a stocking and hidden it under my pillow, which isn't any too comfortable, by the way, kind of bumpy, if you know what I mean. But there's neither here or nor there. Where was I? You realize, madam, that there was a man in the compartment?" "Yes. Well, I just lay there with my eyes closed and wondered what I'd do, and thought, well, I'm just thankful that my daughter doesn't know about the plight I'm in. And then, somehow, I got my wits about me. I felt about my hand and pressed the bell for the conductor. I pressed it, but nothing happened. And I can tell you, I thought my heart was going to stop beating. Mercy, I said to myself, maybe they've murdered every single soul on the train. It was at a standstill, anyhow. There was a nasty, quiet feel in the air. But I just went on pressing the bell, and oh, the relief when I heard footsteps coming running down the corridor, and a knock on the door. 'Come in,' I screamed. I switched on the lights at the same time, and would you believe, there was no soul in there." This seemed to Mrs. Hubbard to be a dramatic climax, rather than an anti-climax. "And what happened next, madam?" "Well, I told the man what had happened, and he didn't seem to believe me, seemed to imagine I dreamed the whole thing. I made him look under the seat, though he said there was enough room for a man to squeeze in there. It was plain enough that the man had got away, but there had been a man in there, and it just made me mad the way conductors try to soothe me down. I'm not to one to imagine things, I don't know what your name is. Poirot, madam. This is Mbok, and the director of the company, and Dr. Constantine." Mrs. Hubbard murmured, "Pleased to meet you, I'm sure," to all three of them in an abstracted manner, and then plunged once more into her recital. "Now, I'm just not going to pretend I was as bright as I might have been. I got into my head that it was the man from next door, the poor fellow who's been killed. I told the conductor to look at the door between the compartments, and sure enough, it wasn't bolted. Well, I soon saw to that. I told him to bolt it then and there, and after he'd gone out, I got up and put a suitcase against it to make sure." "What time was this, Miss Hubbard?" "Well, I'm sure I can't tell you. I never looked to see. I was so upset." "And what is your theory now?" "Why, I should say it was just plain as plain as could be. The man in my compartment was the murderer. Who else could he be?" "And you think he went back into the adjoining compartment?" "How do I know where he went? I had my eyes tight shut." "He might have slipped out through the door into the corridor." "Well, I couldn't say, you see. I had my eyes tight shut." Mrs. Hubbard sighed convulsively. "Mercy, I was scared. My daughter only knew. You do not think, madam, that what you heard was the noise of someone moving about next door in the murdered man's compartment?" "No, I do not, Mr. What is it, Poirot? The man was right there in the same compartment with me. And what's more, I've got proof of it." Triumphantly, she held a large handbag into view, and proceeded to burrow in its interior. She took out in her turn two large clean handkerchiefs, a pair of horror-rimmed glasses, a bottle of aspirin, a packet of Glauber salts, a celluloid tube of bright green peppermints, a bunch of keys, a pair of scissors, a book of American Express checks, a snapshot of an extraordinary plain-looking child, some letters, 5 strings of pseudo-oriental beads, and a small metal object, a button. "You see this button? Well, it's not one of my buttons. It's not off anything I've got. I found it this morning when I got up. I should place it on the table," and Buck leaned forward and gave an exclamation. "But this is a button from the tunic of a wagon attendant. There may be a natural explanation for that," said Poirot. He turned gently to the madam. "This button, madam, may have dropped from the conductor's uniform, either when he searched your cabin or when he was making the bed up last night. I just don't know what's the matter with all you people. Seems as though you don't want to do anything but make objections. Now listen here. I was reading a magazine last night before I went to sleep. Before I turned the light out, I placed the magazine on a little case that was standing on the floor near the window. Have you got that?" They assured her that they had. "Very well, then." The conductor looked under the seat from near the door, and then it came in and bolted the door between me and the next compartment. But you never went near the window. Well, this morning that button was lying right on top of the magazine. What do you call that? I should like to know." "That, madam, I call evidence," said Poirot. The answer seemed to please the lady. "It may matter that a hornet to be disbelieved," she explained. You have given us most interesting and valuable evidence," said Poirot soothingly. "Now may I ask you a few questions?" "Why, certainly." How was it, since you were nervous of this man, Ratchet, that you hadn't already bolted the door between the compartments? I had, returned Mrs. Hubbard promptly. Oh, you had? Well, as a matter of fact, as a Swedish creature, a pleasant soul, if it was bolted. And she said it was. How was it you couldn't see for yourself? Because I was in bed, and my sponge bag was hanging on the door handle. What time was it when you asked her to do this for you? Now let me think. It must have been around 10:30 or 11:15. She come along to see if I had any aspirin. I told her where to find it, and she got out of my grip. You yourself were in bed? Yes. Suddenly she laughed. Poor soul, she was so upset. You see, she opened the door of the next compartment by mistake. Mr. Ratchet's? Yes. You know how difficult it is. You come along the train and all the doors are shut. She opened his by mistake. She was very distressed about it. He laughed to see, and I guess he said something not quite nice. Poor thing, she was certainly upset. Oh, I made a mistake, she said. I ashamed make a mistake. Not nice man, she said. He says, you too old. Dr. Constantine sniggered, and Mrs. Hubbard immediately froze him with a glance. He wasn't a nice kind of man, she said. To say a thing like that to a lady, it's not right to laugh at such things. Dr. Constantine hastily apologized. Did you hear any noise from Mr. Ratchet's compartment after that? Asked Poirot. Well, not exactly. What do you mean by that, madam? Well, she paused. He snored. Ah, he snored, did he? Terribly. That night, the night before, it kept me awake. Didn't hear him snore after you had the scare about a man being in your compartment? Why, Mr. Poirot, how could I? He was dead. Ah, yes, truly, said Poirot. He appeared confused. Do you remember the affair of the Armstrong kidnapping, Mrs. Hubbard? He asked. Yes, indeed I do. And how the wretch that did escape scot-free. My, I like to get my hands on him. He has not escaped. He is dead. He died last night. You don't mean, Mrs. Hubbard half rose from her chair in excitement. But yes, I do. Ratchet was a man. Well, to think of that, I must write and tell my daughter. Now, didn't I tell you last night that the man had an evil face? I was right, you see. My daughter always says, when Mama's got a hunch, you can bet your bottom dollar it's okay. Were you acquainted with any of the Armstrong family, Mrs. Hubbard? No. They moved in a very exclusive circle, but I have always heard that Mrs. Armstrong was a perfectly lovely woman, and that her husband worshipped her. Well, Mrs. Hubbard, you have helped us very much indeed. Perhaps you would give your full name? Why, certainly. Caroline Martha Hubbard. Will you write down your address down here? Mrs. Hubbard did so without ceasing to speak. I just can't get over it, 'cause sitting on this train, I had a hunch about that man, didn't I, Mr. Poirot? Yes, indeed, madam. By the way, have you a silk dressing gown? Mercy, what a funny question. Why, no. I've got 2 dressing gowns with me. A pink flannel one that's kind of cozy for on board ship, and my daughter gave me as a present, a kind of local fair in purple silk. But what in the creation do you want to know about my dressing gowns for? Well, you see, madam, someone in a scarlet kimono entered either your or Mr. Ratchet's compartment last night. It is, as you just know now, very difficult when all the doors are shut to know which compartment it was which. Well, no one in scarlet dressing gown came into my compartment. Then she must have gone into Mr. Ratchet's. Mrs. Hubbard pursed her lips together and said grimly, that wouldn't surprise me any. Poirot leaned forward. So you heard a woman's voice next door? I don't know how you guessed that, Mr. Poirot. I don't really. But, well, as a matter of fact, I did. But when I asked you just now if you heard anything next door, you only said you heard Mr. Ratchet snoring. Well, that was true enough. He did snore part of the time. As for the other, Miss Hubbard got rather embarrassed. It isn't a very nice thing to speak about. What time was it when you heard a woman's voice? I can't tell you. I just woke up for a minute and heard a woman talking. It was plain enough where she was. So I just thought, well, that's kind of a man he is. I'm not surprised. And I went back to sleep again. And I'm sure I should never have mentioned anything of the kind to 3 strange gentlemen if he hadn't dragged it out of me. Was it before the scare about the man in your apartment, or after? Why, that's like what you said just now. He wouldn't have had a woman talking to him if you were dead, would he? Pardon. You must think me very stupid, madam. I guess even you get kind of muddled now and then. I just can't get over its being that monster Cassetti. What my daughter will say. Poirot managed adroitly to help the good lady to replace the contents of her handbag, and then shepherded her towards the door. At the last moment she said, you have dropped your handkerchief, madam. Mrs. Hubbard looked at the little scrap of cambric he held out to her. That's not mine, Mr. Poirot. I got mine right here. Pardon, I thought it was the initial H on it. Well, now that's funny, but certainly not mine. Mine are marked with CMH. And they're sensible things, not expensive Paris flawless. What good is a handkerchief like that to anybody's nose? None of the 3 men seemed to have an answer to this question, and Mrs. Hubbard sailed triumphantly.